Welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. What I want to do in this episode is kind of make the Dr. Jim Ryder master cut. And what I mean by that is I want to have a video on the legacy program oral tradition series that because remember I did that whole series on the ancient Aryans problem in UFO disclosure, but there were two episodes that were focused specifically on oral tradition within the legacy program. So what I want to do is slice together the most important parts of those episodes so that they're all in one place. And that's what this is. Plus, I'm also going to add some extra material that wasn't on the last two videos. Now, what I really recommend, because this compilation is going to be long, is to watch and listen to this video on 1.5 speed, mandatory. You have to use 1.5 speed because it's going to be long. The other thing is to recognize that as you see me in this compilation, I'm going to be wearing different clothes. So it's a compilation. So that's what this is all about. Okay. Why do I think this is important? Because I think, Tom DeLonge kicked off this whole disclosure process. And one of his advisors, I really do think, was Dr. Jim Ryder. Can I prove that? No. But I think at the end of this video, you'll come to understand that it's most likely true. And here's why. Um, First of all, when you look at the intro to Tom DeLonge's fiction, historical fiction, Secret Machines, right? The intro, when he talks about kind of the origin of this project, he talks about this outing at what we now know as Lockheed Martin. And he says an old friend, okay? I don't think that necessarily means somebody he's known a long time. It could just be a friend that was old, right? And Dr. Jim Ryder was a recent retiree, just like this old friend, right? He had retired from Lockheed like early 2012, late 2011, right? And it's summer 2015. So, he's not even he's barely just over 3 years out of the company, right? So it's kind of recently retired, right, from the company, and he is a friend that is old, right? And he would have the pull necessary to introduce him to very important people within the company who then introduce him to important people in, the Air Force and later the intelligence community and that sort of thing. So does this say it was Jim Ryder? No. But as you watch the rest of the video, it'll become obvious why I think there's at least a 50% chance that this old friend was Dr. Jim Ryder, and that Dr. Jim Ryder was somebody who wanted disclosure. That's the name of this episode, the Legacy Program Insider who wanted disclosure. I think that would accurately describe him. And at the end of this episode, you'll see why. So you got to watch the whole thing down 1.5, please. The other thing is, look at the nonfiction books DeLonge put out with uh, Mr. Peter Levenda, right? I really think if you renamed these books Atlanteans, Consciousness, and Nazis, it would work, right? God's Man in War, right? Just rename the series Atlanteans, Consciousness, and Nazis, okay? Because, you go back to God's, the whole book starts with this, a story of a cargo cult. And what is a cargo cult? It's human beings mistakenly worshiping other human beings as gods, right? It's human beings confusing other human beings as gods and worshiping them and starting religions around them, right? Um, and again, just read Man in War, and it's not all about consciousness and it's not all about Nazis. But if you were to rename this series Atlanteans, Consciousness, Nazis, it would work. Okay, and that's important to have in mind as you watch the rest of this episode. The other thing is a really important part of this episode is this book, A Treatise on Cosmic Fire. So what I want to do now is share a little clip from the talk Garment of God by Jim Ryder at the Lucis Trust. And I'm going to just share this clip to establish the fact that he did read this book, right? So it's one thing for me to, have his picture on a slide next to the book and say he read it. But it's another thing for you, the viewer, to actually see that he read the book, right? Um, and it was a hard read. Okay. So that's also going to be important. Those are things you have to put a pin in and kind of, remember as you watch the rest of the series. And you'll see why. So, without further ado, let's go.
I asked Lawrence to mention my technical background. Those who know me well know I almost never do that. But I decided this time to do so. And I'll tell you the context of that, which some questions that I'm going to ask you guys. When I first ran into Alice Bailey's books, I made the choice, the first one I wanted to read was the Treatise on Cosmic Fire. When I've mentioned that to people, everybody else goes, but that's the one I wanted to read. How many of you have read parts of Treatise on Cosmic Fire? Raise your hands, right? How many of you understand it completely? You notice my hand is not up either. Okay, so now we know we're on the same plane. Okay, that part's settled.
Yeah, that part is settled. I just want to get that on record, right? He read this book, okay? And it's actually like the first book he ever read when he got into Lucis Trust and theosophy as taught by Alice Bailey. Okay, so that's important. So now on to the rest of the show. Now, Diana Pasulka, University of North Carolina, religion professor, in various places has talked about how some of the best information regarding the UFO phenomenon within the intelligence community is passed on through an oral tradition. Okay, and this is a selection from her book. Pause the video at any time to read. But essentially, there are pencils up conversations, right, where the secret UFO information is passed, and this keeps it immune from FOIA requests, and it also keeps it immune from email hacks. Okay, so oral tradition is simply any kind of information that's passed on by word of mouth, usually through generations. So with regards to the UFO oral tradition, I'm going to assume you've seen this series I've been doing. You're better served if you do, but if you haven't, here's a quick recap, okay? This is the 2024 UFO hearings at Congress. This is the U.S. House of Representatives Committee repository, where you can, download very interesting documents regarding that hearing. Specifically, I recommend the documents uploaded by Congressman Tim Burchett. If you click on that link, you'll get this, which basically names Dr. Jim Ryder, the then Vice President of Lockheed Martin, as the one who tried to transfer UFO crash retrieval material, okay, not made by human hands, out of this world, from Lockheed Martin to the OSAP program. The OSAP program was the classified Defense Intelligence Agency, okay, the Pentagon UFO program, okay, and it was being administered through Bigelow Aerospace. So there was an attempt at a tech transfer from Lockheed to Bigelow Aerospace as part of this OSAP program of presumably UFO technology, okay? Now, this is Jim Ryder. This is Hal Puthoff. Okay, Jim Ryder, as I said, was the VP of Lockheed Martin, and Hal Puthoff also was part of the OSAP program. Okay, Hal Puthoff is also former director of the CIA Psychic Spy Program. So we have Lockheed and OSAP, Lockheed and OSAP. Okay, this is Jacques Vallée and Hal Puthoff. Now, Jacques Vallée was also part of OSAP, and him and Hal Puthoff have been friends for decades. And this is Jacques Vallée and Jim Ryder. So if you pause and read, basically, Jacques Vallée talked to Jim Ryder, and Jim Ryder told him all about the failed tech transfer. Jacques Vallée doesn't explicitly name Jim Ryder, but how many other former VPs of Lockheed Martin had recently retired and were friends with both these men, uh, and who, was part of this, tech transfer from Lockheed to OSAP. Okay, so this is Jim Ryder. All right, so this part of Jacques Vallée's journal talks all about the failed tech transfer. You can read it for yourself anytime you want. Fast forward a few years, Tom DeLonge gets tapped by the intelligence community, okay, via Lockheed Martin, in order to kind of lead this disclosure effort, this slow drip disclosure effort. And we know this because he was in communications with some very important people. Uh, Jim Ryder's successor, Bob Weiss, who was the new VP of Lockheed Martin. He was talking with General Neil McCaslin of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which, again, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is where the Roswell wreckage was taken to. Major General Carey, Malia Fisher, who was part of the uh, Hillary Clinton campaign. And again, everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president of the United States. And John Podesta, who had the ear of the then sitting president, Barack Obama. So during this time, we also know that Tom DeLonge had some advisors, admirals, generals, who were telling him some very interesting things about the UFO phenomenon, specifically that the UFO phenomenon isn't just about aliens, but it's also about Atlantis and secret Nazi technology. Okay, so that's a story. UFOs are about aliens, Atlantis, and secret Nazi technology, right? And so they kick off TTSA, which was supposed to be this public benefit corporation. You could Google all the people on this panel if you want. There's beautiful TTSA logo. Then Tom DeLonge, after the kickoff, goes on Joe Rogan and has a very interesting interview. And then not long after that, you have the two bombshell reports, okay, by the New York Times and Washington Post about OSAP, okay, which sometimes was also referred to as ATIP, right? About the ATIP program. Um, and this was, the big reveal, right? That finally the government admitted that yes, we have an interest in UFOs and we're secretly studying them, right? And all this was catalyzed again by Tom DeLonge's little group, okay, which again was something that he was tapped to do by, Lockheed Martin and whatever other deep state actors, such as the CIA. So that's what happened. Okay, that's the summary of our last few episodes. But again, this UFO thing with the Nazi technology and in Atlantis. Okay, what do we do with that? I think we should listen to Tom DeLonge, what he said on Rogan, because it's very interesting and pertinent.
I do know that there's connections to man, you won't even fucking believe it. I'll tell you that. You want to hear?
Please.
Atlantis.
Atlantis, the sunken city?
Yeah.
There's a connection?
There's a connection.
What's the connection?
That there's a very advanced group that left after a catastrophe and hung around in a small outpost here and throughout time would push civilization forward, and that's who the Greek gods were.
Whoa.
Yep. And that's why it's very interesting on the Roswell wreckage, there's Greek writing.
Is there?
There is.
I've never seen any of the wreckage from Roswell. Have you?
It's online. You see it. Type in Roswell wreckage. You can see it.
Well,
Type
all I've ever seen is the dude standing in front of the bullshit, the weather balloon stuff, where they're laughing and yucking it up.
Roswell wreckage, Roswell I-beam. You'll see it, and it's got these Greek markings. And the witnesses that were there did what do you call it? Where they go on oath and tell. So that
actual I-beam showing the word Eleftheria,
which means freedom in ancient Greek. So
where is that from, Jamie?
Let me tell you, want me to,
I don't know. It popped up when it.
Well,
I'm going to tell you something else. So
Okay.
I went and met a former director of CIA and NSA. He was director of both. I won't tell you his name. And right when I sat down and told him about my book,
pull that picture up again. Look at those little hands.
and right when I sat down and told him about this is a big deal.
Okay,
what I'm
good.
about to
Sorry.
say. So I'm sitting with this guy. He was like, not that long ago, was director of CIA, and he went on to be director of NSA. Okay.
Well, I think we can find his name.
Maybe. But right when I sat down and told him about the book, you know what he says to me?
What?
He goes, I didn't read much science fiction as a kid, but I read a lot about Greek mythology. And looked me in the eye. I said, well, you're going to love the last page of my book then. He's all, am I? And when my book was about ready to go to pressing, I had a very important person call me up. He says, can you stop that pressing and maybe insert something about Greek mythology? And I said, I sure can. So something you got to realize is, for example, the 6th biggest defense contractor in the world, at least they used to be 6, is a company called Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC. Their headquarters are actually in San Diego. And in the front of the building, you have an obelisk coming out of a fake lake and 2 Atlantean on thrones. And they're both holding pyramids. And one says the past and one says the future. And they're 8-foot tall statues. It's fucking nuts, by the way. In SAIC, they went over to Lidos.
Okay, so that's interesting. Okay. Let's assume for the sake of argument that Tom DeLonge is right, that the UFOs have something to do with aliens, Atlantis, and secret Nazi tech. And let's assume that if that's true, look, if that's true, then that's something Jim Ryder would know. Which led me in my previous videos to ask, well, what kind of books does this guy read, right? And that led me to lose his trust, right? Because if this guy has a bigger knowledge base, right, than most people, because he's in the big secret, right? He knows about the UFOs and that they're somehow connected to aliens, secret Nazi technology, and Atlantis. And if he has strong spiritual impulses, right? He's a spiritual person and he wants spirituality in his life. Well, he's going to try to find something that doesn't conflict with what he knows, right? With what he learned in his job. And so, you go to that video on YouTube, The Garment of God, which is a commentary on a specific concept in a book called The Treatise on Cosmic Fire, right? And in that book, it mentions root races, right? The Atlantean and the Aryan, right? So I thought that was very interesting, right? But then if you go deeper, right, you go back to this oral tradition that I talked about in my last video, right? And well, that same formula is found in A Treatise on Cosmic Fire. So now we're caught up. Now we can talk about what I really want to talk about, okay? Because basically you have this formula about UFOs, that they're about energy, consciousness, and form, that this is how you should investigate UFOs. But then you have the same formula, right? It appears in A Treatise on Cosmic Fire, okay? Now, the question I have is this oral tradition, right? Where did it start? Did it start with Paul Tyler or did he receive it from somebody else, right? Valet doesn't say in his journals. But then how do we explain, presence of that formula in a book written in 1925, which is A Treatise on Cosmic Fire? Well, the missing link is Jim Ryder, right? We know for a fact he read this book. And he was well read enough in that book to give a presentation on it and lose his trust. Okay. So I propose a theory that basically this formula, right, that we should study UFOs from the point of view of energy, consciousness, and form is from Jim Ryder. And he was inspired by A Treatise on Cosmic Fire. So Jim Ryder started this very specific formula, right? This part of the oral tradition. Here's an example of oral tradition in the UFO research, right? In the deep black UFO research. right? And it's this formula of energy, consciousness, and form. I propose that Jim Ryder is the one that's created this formula and that he was inspired by the works of Alice Bailey. Now, granted, if you look at Alice Bailey, she's not talking about UFOs here. She's talking about the solar system, right? So he appropriated this, right? He interpreted it. He thought it was applicable somehow, okay, based on one, his understanding of this book and also his understanding of the UFO phenomenon, which again, as we went over earlier, is based on actual contact with, you know, alien technology. So I think this works, and I also think it's productive. And I'll tell you why. Energy, consciousness, and form. What kind of energy? Right? I'm not a physicist, and I'm not a theosophist either, right? I don't know much about Alice Bailey's teachings, and I didn't get a PhD in physics. I don't even have a BS in physics or anything like that. So, I can't attempt to read the mind of the late great Jim Ryder and see how he might have connected the dots. If you watch his video, I mean, he and his audience, they get a chuckle over the fact that Alice Bailey's book is hard to understand, right? So if it's hard to understand, then it may lend itself to this kind of interpretation by Jim Ryder. But, be that as it may, I can't read the mind of the deceased, okay? And he's not here to explain. But I think this theory, right, this reconstruction of the oral tradition, specifically this formula, this example of oral tradition, um, is productive. And here's why. Again, energy, consciousness, and form. What kind of energy? Are we talking about kinetic energy, potential energy, positive energy? No, we're talking about negative energy. Now, what Alice Bailey meant by that, I don't know. Um, but we know what physicists mean by it. Again, remember, Jim Ryder and Hal Puthoff know each other. This is Hal Puthoff's paper on negative mass propulsion, which basically explains how UFOs work. And look, in order to have a warp bubble, you need negative energy. Quote, in order to implement a warp drive, one would have to construct a warp bubble that surrounded the spacecraft by generating a thin shell or surface layer of exotic matter, i.e., a quantum field having negative energy and or negative pressure. If you look at the DIA reference documents that were produced by OSAP, right? Here's an interesting one on warp drive, dark energy, and the manipulation of extra dimensions. Okay. One again, the requirements for warp drive, among other things, you need you need negative energy. Okay, negative energy, negative energy. Okay, so I think not only is this theory correct, right? That what you have in Vallee's journal from 1990 is an example of the oral tradition, the kind of oral tradition Dr. Pasulka talks about. But we can actually, in this case, with this specific formula, locate its origin, right? It comes from the work of Alice Bailey, right? And Jim Ryder appropriated it. He leveraged it because in some way it converged with his understanding of UFOs, and that this is how it got into Lockheed Martin, right? Into Skunk Works. And again, Paul Tyler transmitted it to Ron Blackburn, who transmitted it to Jacques Vallée. Now, there may be some intermediary transmitters, right? Maybe Jim Ryder learned it from Ben Rich, or maybe there was a transmitter in between Jim Ryder and Paul Tyler. I don't know. I like this formulation of the ISNAD because it doesn't require hypothetical anonymous transmitters, right? we have enough people on record to make this kind of transmission chain work. And again, I think it's very productive. Okay, energy, consciousness, and form. What kind of energy? Negative energy. Oh yeah, why? Because that's what you need for warp drive. You need negative energy densities of the kind I don't understand. Okay, going back to Jim Ryder. When he speaks at Lucis Trust, he gives a talk on UFOs, and there's a part of that talk where it's just kind of like a question and answer with his co-host, right? So he gives his presentation, and then it's his turn to answer questions from his host, right? On behalf of the audience, let's say. And when he talks about the UFO phenomenon, he does so in terms of energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable. Okay, the VP of Lockheed Martin, former VP of Lockheed Martin, giving a talk on UFOs at Lucis Trust. Okay, during the question and answer section, right? He talks about UFOs in terms of energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable in that order. And we're gonna watch that video right now.
Forest.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a very good example of how cultural conditioning can fool the senses and make you interpret something that is actually different to what you first think.
Yes, it's a forest incident. It goes back in England. This picture here is giving some indication in England where it was. You can look it up on Wikipedia and all sorts of other things, and get all sorts of nice arguments. But one of the keys in it, and it has been done with others, is people believing that I've seen a solid object. So remember the pictures of the flying saucers. And you certainly do see things. And the reason I put in the two drawings and the photograph is that you can draw what you thought, but interesting enough, you can take a picture of it too. So whatever it is not just in one's mind or something else. And the question that I'm referring to is when we talk that they were convinced, some of the investigators, they did feel metal. There was, quote, a ship there.
Just to set the scene, they were working in a laboratory or
No,
something?
oh, that's right, working in a forest.
In a
That's
forest,
right.
yeah.
And where the investigators were sent to really go study it, because it was still there. And to their surprise, they did see a bright object that appeared like a UFO. And they tried to touch it and reported it was metal.
These were scientists.
These are highly trained technical people.
They just sound a little bit silly to me. I mean, if you saw a bright glowing object landing in the forest, would you go up and touch it?
If you're a scientist, yeah.
I might have. I would get the technicians to do it. Okay.
No, they did. What I did in that case is ask the question to the investigators. Go back and ask them a different question. Don't ask them if they touched and felt metal. Ask them, did they feel like there was a pressure on their hand, and did the pressure get greater? So to make a long story short, that investigation was done. And it came back with the answer that actually they don't think now they did feel metal. What they felt was that the closer they got their hand to the light, the more resistance, until they reached the point that the light was glowing around their hand and they could not make their hand go any further, like it was resisted. And as they put their hand away, it got less resistant. And that's changed how people do research studies on this now. You begin to realize that maybe we thought it was a solid object, like our first quotes, but now we realize that it's not a solid object.
I don't know if it occurred in this incident, but certainly in other ones like that, there's been a lot of severe burning through contact with them that you
Yes,
mentioned.
there has been, and it's, I guess the best I can say that the technical scientific world does not know what to do with that, because it's outside of at the very end of this, and maybe after even people ask questions, I'm going to give some comments of some very leading scientists, Max Planck Institute, many others that some of you may know the names of, who in the last 3 or 4 years have just completely changed their concepts about what is going on this planet. And you'll find that it is very close to the ageless wisdom, actually.
So we are moving into the era that when we are starting to open up to the idea of inner dimensions, at least, where or phenomena that science certainly can't explain. But to my mind, anyway, the whole idea of explaining it through some form of panpsychism or the aliveness of all things, of the hierarchies and the organisational aspect of them, makes a lot more sense than visitors on the physical plane from Andromeda and Captain Zob of the Galactic Federation that you sort of see all over the internet. But apart from anything else, from the perspective of the ageless wisdom, apart from anything louder, apart from anything else...
Can't hear either of us? Yell.
Apart from anything else that's the idea of extraterrestrials on the physical plane, abductions and these kind of things, they just don't fit into the way that the ageless wisdom portrays the life that evolves on all the various suns and planets in the universe, because each of them, each logos has a ring pass knot, and it's not going to be violated by alien adventures from other planets. If we look at, we know from the ageless wisdom that every planet in our solar system is teeming with life. It's just at a frequency, that our 5 senses can't register. And there is often an isolation period where the race on a different planet has to grow through its own sense of discrimination. Otherwise we just become automatons. And so the whole idea of hostile aliens abducting people and experimenting on them just seems wrong from that point of view. But when you get into the whole idea of the psychic world, then it can be explained by many things. But the alien abductions, I think you've got something to say about.
It probably always, I'm sure many of you read about abductions. The other strange one is whoever the abductors are, often abduct women, they impregnate them, and then they have these strange UFO human babies. No one's ever discovered one of those, by the way. And then the women who go through this in modern times have referred to that they sometimes get taken up again to feed the child. And they actually describe that. Interestingly enough, people who have been moved out of their rooms and flown out the window, women who've gone through that, have actually been investigated in sealed rooms where they go to bed and sleep, and the room is locked from the outside. There are no windows in it, there are no doors in it, and they have cameras on them all the time. And those people do experience what I just described while in the room, and the cameras and all of the sound pickups show nothing happened in the room except she snored or he snored that night. So whatever's happening is not happening physically. And it's also been shown that those same descriptions go back 25 to 30,000 years, certainly back to Roman times. In fact, if I could summarize on UFOs, a few comments that one of the great explorers in this field is Jacques Vallée, who's actually an American. He's actually an astrophysicist, and he studied this for a long time. And some of the senior leaders in this field are actually astrophysicists, so they do know a lot about stars and planets. And as he summarized, the UFOs are not objects nor flying. It's an unidentified flying object. But they're not an object and it's not flying, because an object is something that I can hit. The light beam is not an object, but you can't do that with them. And they're not flying because you never actually see them flying. They appear. So that's why I use UAPs. It's an aerial, it's a phenomena, and it's unexplained. But it isn't flying, and it's not an object. So there's some other odd things. If you study the Old Testament and the Bible, there are numerous things. The burning bush, certain angel encounters. In antiquity, we called those gods and goddesses. If you study the medieval times, The same things, except the saucer wasn't saucer shaped, it was shaped like a chariot. And it didn't have lights rotating around like that. It had lights in the front, lights in the back, and lights on the horses, and they flew through the sky like that. And they also have descriptions of women being abducted into the chariots and impregnated by the gods in the chariots. So it's the same story all the time. But in the medieval times, they called it magic, magicians. And in the 19th century, it founded new religions. And some said it was scientific geniuses. And because of time, I won't go into the religions.
Okay, so what do we have here? Okay. He talked about UFOs in terms of energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable in that order. Okay. And you'll also notice that he never mentioned, if actually, I recommend you watch the entire talk on Vimeo. I'll put a link in the description. He never mentions crash retrievals, and he never mentions UFO right? He doesn't talk about UFO at all in that presentation. Okay? He doesn't talk about who's piloting the craft. No mention of Nords, no mention of Greys, none of that. And as Leo Strauss taught us, okay, when you're looking at esoteric writers, or in this case, an esoteric speaker, because we have to look at him as such by definition, right? Because this was the former VP of Lockheed Martin, and 80% of their portfolio is classified, right? So this is an esotericist by definition. The omissions are important, right? He doesn't talk about crash retrievals. He doesn't talk about beings who pilot the crashes, right? That's substantive. Now, regardless of what you think about what he said, the fact is he did talk about UFOs in that order in terms of energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable. And that is exactly what we have in this oral tradition. Energy, consciousness, and form. Energy, consciousness, and form. I really do think he is the originator of this tradition within Lockheed that was eventually received by Jacques Vallée and recorded in his book Forbidden Science. Okay, because as you can see in the video we just saw, that formula provided the framework through which he taught about the UFO phenomenon, and also provided the framework for which he understood the UFO phenomenon. Okay, now in this video, which is near the end of Garment of God, okay, we're gonna see the formula again. But more importantly, we're gonna see why he might have wanted disclosure to go forward, and why he helped Tom DeLonge, and why he helped the other people who are, pushing this ball forward until his final illness and death, right? So that's important. So we're gonna go. So in the following video, look for the formula again. It's gonna appear, and look for the motivation for him wanting to push disclosure along behind the scenes. If you haven't noticed by now, I mean, geez, getting blocked by CIA when you had this technology that you kind of, I don't want to say gave up on, but you studied it as much as you could, right? And you did as much as you could with it, right? And they brought it out periodically and put it back in the crates, brought it out periodically, put it back in the crates, letting new generations of scientists work on it and fail. And now he wants to open the crates again, right? Hand this stuff over to Bigelow Aerospace, because presumably the juice ain't worth the squeeze, right? They have to spend all this money on security and counterintelligence and all this stuff. And, they're not making heads or tails of it. So let's give it to Bigelow Aerospace. Let's let these new people with fresh ideas and fresh eyes look at this. And the CIA blocks him, right? You could imagine someone being a little bit bitter about that, right? And thinking, look, you are just, you crazy people are just keeping us from progressing, right? So without further ado, let's watch the video that kind of shows what I'm talking about.
That's how quickly this is coming out. So the nature of form, it's an electrical system, consciousness resides in it. There's a home for a quote soul. The soul is garmented by a form. It works through form, a conscious systems.
Okay, there it is again. Look, it's right here. Energy, consciousness, and form, right? And so, whereas the earlier part of this series, this video, right, we talked about negative energy. You have consciousness, which doesn't seem to move. It's always the center part of this formula. Okay. But then you had form. And then, so the question is, well, what is form, right? So it seems like in Alice Bailey's original conception, right, form is the home for soul awareness of the lower planes. Okay. The soul is garmented by form. It works through form conscious system. So it seems like form is our body, right? Our material body, right? And again, remember this formula comes from Alice Bailey's writings, but then it's appropriated by Jim Ryder, and becomes the lens through which he studies the UFO phenomenon and understands it. But here it is, right? You have electricity, consciousness, and form, right? Energy, consciousness, and form. There's a formula again. Now we're going to see what this is all about for him. Okay, consciousness and all that sort of thing.
As one wrote, the behavior of human beings reduces to physics as a science of matter in motion. Dr. Pitstick wrote, Soul Proof, 9 things. After death context, near death, miraculous revelatory experiences, scientific and paranormal input, prenatal evidence of cyclical life experiences. That's called reincarnation. This is coming out from the psychiatrist. First-hand experiences, and he says, and all these other ways of knowing. DK wrote, when humanity is assured of divinity and immortality and has entered into a state of knowledge of the nature of the soul, of the kingdom in which the soul functions, its attitude to daily life, to current affairs, will undergo such a transformation that we shall verily and indeed see the emergence of a new heaven and a new earth. When I first read that years ago, it was like hopeful. I didn't think I'd start seeing it. Well, this is where I'm going to end in these couple of charts. He wrote 13 evidence of the soul would be found. There they are. And I wrote, is science now verified those? Psychics of the world, yes, ESP wars. When he first wrote that, oh, come on, there's no psychic communication. Now there's releasing books by the military guys. Jeez. Growth of color sense. Are there kids seeing colors at levels that we shouldn't see? On the suspicion of etheric vision already showing. Survival of death. Absolutely. It didn't imply immortality. That's DK's words. Does not imply it's immortal, but you do get reborn. There's study of creative people, artists, scientists, poets. Why are they like that and not like others? There's some data. That's why I put it in yellow. The nature of genius. What does it really mean? There's some data. It's not as solid as the others. We don't even know if we compared creative work training from training and the difference of that between that and vocational training. You should go to the vocational thing. You should go to the other, right? Well, I don't know. How do we know? We didn't want to study that because it can't be related to soul, right? There's a bunch more. Is there telepathy? Absolutely, I know there's telepathy. It works just fine. My friends who did some of the other things, and now their work's been published, and they did the first work some 40 years ago. Dr. Putoff's one, Dr. Targ, who's worked for me for years, is another one. It's fun being able to say these things. Are there clairvoyants and clairvoyant powers? Absolutely, we now can do that. Is there a recognition by the psychologists that there is a self? Yes, today. Is there, from study of light and radiation, do we see some evidence of what he's talking about? Yes. Oh, power of prevision. You know, stuff, shouldn't cross the street, the car's coming. That's been studied now in detail, because we can. Unless we have all these electronic things we can wear around. When people volunteer, my heavens, it does seem to work. His 12th one is from testimony, evidence, and use of soul, force, and powers. A and B, I know I can have references that say yes. I don't know about the last one. I don't think so. Because the scientists haven't quite jumped. Well, now, what's the soul powers? We need to look it up in cosmic fire more, right? And then we can study it. And I don't know about the soul and its governing laws, because that implies you have to now start studying. First you had me go to matter, and then you had me go to conscience. Now you want me to study soul. Well, that's where they're getting at. I summarized it. Yeah, 2 minutes. 9 yeses to those, 2 maybes, and 2 unknown. Now, if I had to turn in my theme paper, I'd say proven. At least to pretty good odds. I can't read that one, so I will for you. The proof of soul existence and intuitive and instinctive response to soul nurture, thus prove of spiritual entity in man, both wise, immortal, divine, and creative. That's exactly what's in DK's Cosmic Fire. And so I'm going to wind down here.
Okay, so the motive, right? As I studied kind of, as I listened to this guy's talks, right? And I keep in mind that this is a guy who, you know, had firsthand knowledge of UFO crash retrievals. And I know just from my own study and, you know, just following ufology that there does seem to be this UFO to consciousness pipeline, right? Where people start off as nuts and bolts, and then the more they study the phenomenon, they go off into consciousness, right? And that's, you know, the theme of this whole channel, thoughts and bolts, right? Because I think you have to use parapsychology and physics to understand the UFO phenomenon and history. You know, ufology is like this weird thing that straddles history, physics, and parapsychology. Okay. So, you know, I can relate to this, you know, emphasis on consciousness, especially since it's what you can talk about legally, right? But why would he be interested in disclosure, right? Why is he the guy I'm arguing, um, you know, wanted it? It's because he's a spiritual guy, and he believed the advent of the new age was, you know, close sooner than later, right? And that would come based on what we just saw from human beings understanding their mental potential, right? And the immortal nature of their soul or their mind, consciousness itself. Um, and that this is somehow a prerequisite for, you know, a new heaven and a new earth, to understand, as I've said before, that we're not meat robots, but that we have minds, and that they're capable of far more um, than, you know, popular culture would have us believe. And that's all like where the UFO phenomenon, the close encounter phenomenon, leads to, because as you know, like telepathy is a big part of the close encounter phenomenon. Okay. So I think this provides the motive for why he would want disclosure, right? Why he would help DeLonge behind the scenes initially, right? It's not just a national security issue. It's not just let's get more scientists who normally wouldn't be able to pass the background checks to work on this stuff, right? So that we can beat China, so that we can beat Russia. For sure, that's a part of it. But I think that for, if there is this UFO to consciousness pipeline, and it would be more extreme in somebody who actually was part of the legacy UFO program. And if that's the case, and he's, a reader of Alice Bailey, and he's, you know, hoping for the new age to come, and that, the spectral revolution, right? The acceptance of these, psychic abilities that human beings have, and, the findings of parapsychology vis-a-vis the survival hypothesis. If those are acknowledging those are prerequisites for the new age, it would make sense that he would want the UFO phenomenon to go mainstream and to come out of the shadows, right? So that human beings could have that awareness of the paranormal, of the parapsychological in its reality, so as to, have that new heaven and new earth, as he quoted. So that's what I think. I think Jim Ryder wasn't just a member of the legacy program, but he also was somebody who wanted disclosure to happen. Okay, which is why he gave some of these talks literally a year or 2 years before he died, right? And he said what he could say at that time. And I think he also said what he thought was the most important thing to understand about all of this. And that's why I always tell you your consciousness is not classified, right? Your consciousness is not classified. Go deep, study it, play with it. As long as you don't hurt yourself or anybody else or break the law, study that. And you understand the UFO phenomenon better by doing that than by watching this show. Good night.